She showed up for the free steak 7 months pregnant, her lower back screaming. He was a logistics CEO drowning in single fatherhood, expecting a breezy professional. When her water glass tipped spilling ice directly onto her massive protruding belly, the restaurant went dead silent. His reaction broke every rule. The air conditioning in Emerson's 2012 Honda Civic had given up somewhere around mid-July. Now in late August, the car felt like a rolling terrarium. Emerson sat in the restaurant parking lot staring at the glowing dashboard clock. 7:14 p.m. She was late. She didn't care. She pressed 2 fingers against her temples, trying to massage away the dull throb behind her eyes. Her feet, crammed into black flats that had fit perfectly in the first trimester, felt like overstuffed sausages. Beneath her oversized navy blouse, the baby shifted a rolling heavy pressure that landed squarely on her bladder. Emerson winced, shifting her weight on the worn fabric of the driver's seat, breathing in the lingering scent of stale crushed Cheerios and the sharp, chemical smell of baby wipes. "Just go in, eat the Wagyu, and leave," she muttered to the empty passenger seat. Her friend Parker had set this up. Parker, who meant well, but lived in a bubble of Pilates classes and aesthetic iced lattes. He's a CEO, Emerson. Logistics, or shipping or something. Very stable. You need stable right now. Parker had intentionally glossed over a few things when setting up this blind date. Primarily the fact that Emerson was already a single mother to a feral 4-year-old named Sam, and secondly, that she was currently incubating another human. Emerson hoisted herself out of the car. The humid evening air hit her like a wet towel. She grabbed her purse, adjusted the maternity band biting into her lower belly, and walked toward the entrance of Laura, a downtown restaurant that smelled of roasted garlic, expensive leather, and unearned confidence. The hostess, a girl who looked no older than 19 and possessed the skeletal structure of a whippet, blinked at Emerson's midsection. "Reservation." Under haze, Emerson set her voice flat. "Right this way." Emerson followed the hostess through the dimly lit dining room. The ambient noise was a low hum of clinking heavy silverware and soft jazz. It was the kind of place where the napkins felt like bed sheets and the water glasses were heavy enough to cause blunt force trauma. She spotted him before the hostess stopped. Arthur Hayes. He didn't look like a CEO. He didn't have that slick predatory gloss Emerson associated with corporate men. He was sitting in a curved booth, staring at his phone. His dark suit jacket was draped over the back of the chair, and his white button-down was slightly rumpled at the elbows. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, dragging his thumb across the deep bruised shadows beneath his dark eyes. As he reached for his water glass, Emerson noticed a bright, jagged smear of neon pink marker across his left cuff. He was exhausted. It radiated off him like heat off asphalt. "Mr. Hayes," the hostess murmured. Arthur looked up. He pocketed his phone in one smooth motion, his polite practiced smile already forming. Then he saw her. Or rather, he saw the sheer undeniable geometry of her. Emerson stood there, flushed, sweaty, her navy blouse doing absolutely nothing to hide the heavy, low-hanging reality of her 7-month pregnancy. The silence stretched. It wasn't a dramatic, gasping silence. It was the heavy, suspended quiet of a man's brain completely rebooting. "I'm Emerson," she said. She didn't offer her hand. No, she just stood there waiting for the inevitable excuse. The sudden stomach ache. The emergency work call. Arthur's eyes flicked from her face down to her stomach and back up to her face. He blinked twice. The polite smile had vanished, replaced by a look of profound, almost comical confusion. "You're—" He stopped. He cleared his throat, the sound rough. Parker didn't mention. Parker is an idiot, Emerson said plainly. If you want to leave, I get it. I just want you to know I'm not paying for the breadbasket. Arthur stared at her. A muscle ticked in his jaw. Then slowly the tension bled out of his shoulders. He didn't storm off. He didn't look disgusted. He just looked resigned. Sit down, Emerson, he said, his voice surprisingly deep, a low rumble that cut through the restaurant's background noise. He slid out of the booth, stepping aside to give her room to maneuver her bulk into the corner. The breadbasket is on me. Do you need a cushion for your back? Emerson froze her hand, resting on the smooth leather of the seat. She looked at him, searching for the joke, the condescension. There was none, just tired bloodshot eyes and a faint smell of sandalwood and old coffee. No, she said carefully, lowering herself into the booth. Just water. Lots of it. The waiter appeared like a phantom holding a bottle of sparkling water. Drinks for the table. I'll have a scotch neat, Arthur said. Macallan, if you have it. He glanced at Emerson. And ice water for the lady, with lemon. Make it a pitcher, Emerson added, unapologetic. The waiter vanished. Arthur steepled his fingers on the white tablecloth. The pink marker stain on his cuff caught the candlelight. So, Arthur began, his voice dry. When are you due? 8 weeks, Emerson said. She reached for a piece of sourdough from the basket in the center of the table. She ripped it in half. I'll save us the small talk. I am a 32-year-old divorced mother of one. The father of this one. She gestured with the bread toward her stomach, decided that fatherhood was a bit too restrictive for his creative journey. He plays bass in a band that covers Red Hot Chili Peppers songs. He currently lives in his van. She shoved the bread into her mouth, chewing aggressively. She expected Arthur to cringe. She wanted him to cringe. It was a defense mechanism. Push them away before they can walk away. Instead, Arthur let out a short, hollow laugh. It wasn't a happy sound. It was the sound of a man who recognized the absurdity of life. Creative journey, Arthur echoed, shaking his head. That's a new one. Did he at least leave a forwarding address for the child's support? Van Emerson repeated, swallowing the bread. Hard to serve papers to afford transit. The waiter returned, setting the scotch in front of Arthur and a massive, sweating pitcher of ice water in front of Emerson. Arthur picked up his glass, tipped it toward her in a mock toast, and took a long, slow swallow. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second as the liquor hit. Your turn, Emerson said, pouring herself a glass of water. Parker said you run shipping containers or something, and you have a kid. Toby, he's 6. Arthur set the glass down. He traced the rim with his index finger. And yes, I run a mid-sized logistics firm, which means I spend 14 hours a day yelling at port authorities on the phone. And the mother, in Bali. Arthur's tone was completely devoid of emotion. It was a practiced neutrality. Finding her center, she realized about 3 years ago that she didn't want to be a mother or a wife. She wanted to be a free spirit. So she bought a one-way ticket, left a note on the kitchen island next to a pile of unpaid electric bills, and that was that. Emerson stopped chewing. She looked at the pink marker on his cuff. Is Toby a free spirit, too? Arthur looked down at his sleeve, finally noticing the stain. He sighed, rubbing at it uselessly with his thumb. Toby is a hurricane. He painted the neighbor's golden retriever blue this morning. Washable paint, thank God, but Mrs. Gable was not amused. Pink marker, Emerson observed, nodding at his wrist. Collateral damage from the peace negotiations. A strange, quiet camaraderie settled over the table. It wasn't romantic chemistry. It was the grim, silent nod of two soldiers passing each other in the mud. They were both drowning just in different oceans. Emerson felt the baby kick again, a sharp, sudden jab to her ribs. She gasped a sharp intake of breath, her hand flying to her side. Her elbow caught the heavy condensation-covered water glass. It tipped. Time seemed to slow down. The heavy crystal struck the edge of the table, shattering the ice inside, and sent a freezing wave of water cascading directly onto Emerson's lap, soaking through her thin maternity trousers and pooling on the leather seat beneath her. The clatter of the glass hitting the floor echoed like a gunshot. The conversation at the tables around them died instantly. Heads turned. Eyes stared. The well-dressed patrons of Laura looked on with poorly concealed distaste at the wet, pregnant woman making a scene in the corner. Emerson froze. The icy water seeped into her clothes, shocking her skin. A hot, prickling wave of humiliation crept up her neck. She was exhausted. She was enormous. She smelled like cheap car exhaust, and now she had essentially wet herself in public. She waited for Arthur to call the waiter, to apologize, to the room, to excuse himself, to the bathroom, and never return. Arthur didn't look at the room. He didn't look embarrassed. He moved with frightening speed. He grabbed the thick cloth napkins from the table, stood up, and stepped into her space. "Stand up!" He ordered, his voice low, steady, entirely focused on her. Emerson, too, stunned to argue, slid out of the booth, her soaked trousers clinging to her thighs. Arthur didn't hesitate. He dropped to one knee right there in the middle of the dining room. He began dabbing at the hem of her blouse and the soaked fabric around her knees, with the thick napkin soaking up the freezing water. "I've got it," Emerson stammered, her face burning. "I can—" "It's ice water, Emerson," Arthur said calmly, not looking up, his hands working quickly. "You're shivering, and the AC in here is set to meat locker." He stood up, abandoning the wet napkins on the floor. Without asking, he shrugged off his suit jacket, the expensive tailored dark wool, and draped it over her shoulders. The jacket was heavy, holding his body heat, smelling faintly of the dry cleaners and him. It fell past her hips, covering the worst of the water stain on her pants. "Better?" he asked, looking her dead in the eye. At the next table, a woman with a tight facelift and a diamond collar cleared her throat loudly. "Excuse me," she muttered to her dining companion, loud enough to be heard. "The staff really should enforce a dress code. This isn't a cafeteria." Arthur turned his head. The movement was slow, deliberate. He locked eyes with the woman. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" Arthur's voice was polite, but the temperature in it had dropped to absolute zero. It was the voice of a man who negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts with hostile vendors. The woman bristled. "I just think—" "I suggest you focus on your oysters." Arthur interrupted, his volume barely above a whisper, yet carrying absolute authority. "Before I buy this restaurant and turn it into a parking lot." The woman's mouth snapped shut. She looked away suddenly, very interested in her plate. Arthur turned back to Emerson, the coldness vanishing from his face. "Do you want to leave?" he asked gently. "We can go get drive-through. I know a place that does incredible greasy burgers. No dress code." Emerson pulled his jacket tighter around herself. The humiliation was receding, replaced by a strange, unfamiliar warmth spreading in her chest. No one had stood up for her like that in years. No one had taken care of a mess she made. "No." Emerson said, her voice shaking slightly, but she steadied it. She looked at the menu still sitting on the dry side of the table. "I want the Wagyu steak, medium rare, and I want the truffle fries." A genuine crooked smile broke across Arthur's face. It transformed him. The exhaustion was still there, but the shadows seemed less harsh. "Wagyu it is," he said. He signaled the hovering, terrified waiter. "And bring another pitcher of water. Leave the ice out this time." The steak arrived sizzling, smelling of charred fat and rosemary. Emerson ate like a starved animal, cutting large pieces and chewing with an intensity that would have embarrassed her 10 years ago. Now, she just needed the iron. Arthur watched her. He had ordered a modest salmon fillet, which he pushed around his plate, eating only methodically as if fueling a machine rather than enjoying a meal. He wasn't staring at her with disgust. He looked almost fascinated, like he was observing a force of nature. "So," Arthur said, resting his forearms on the table. 4-year-old and one on the way. "How are you doing that?" He didn't ask it with pity. That was the crucial difference. Pity was what Parker gave her. Pity was the tilted head and the soft, "Oh, you poor thing" voice. Arthur asked it like an engineer analyzing a bridge that shouldn't be standing, but miraculously was. "Caffeine spite and a lot of frozen chicken nuggets," Emerson replied, wiping a smear of meat juice from the corner of her mouth with a fresh napkin. "Sam is intense. He has sensory processing issues. Tags and shirts make him scream. The wrong texture of a sock can ruin a Tuesday. I spent half my day negotiating hostage situations over footwear." Arthur nodded slowly, recognition flaring in his dark eyes. "Toby hates the seams in his socks. We have to turn them inside out." Emerson paused a piece of steak halfway to her mouth. "You do the inside-out sock trick. I buy the seamless ones online now," Arthur said. "Costs an arm and a leg, but it saves me 20 minutes of screaming at 7 a.m. He leaned back, his gaze drifting to the ceiling for a moment before returning to her. "The hardest part isn't the tantrums. It's the quiet. When he goes to sleep and the house is just dead. And you're sitting there staring at a wall, wondering if you completely ruined them that day. Because you yelled about a spilled cup of juice." Emerson swallowed hard. The steak suddenly tasted like ash. He had hit the exact bruised nerve of her daily existence. The crushing guilt of solo parenting. "Last week," Emerson said, her voice dropping, losing its cynical edge. She looked down at her water glass tracing the rim. "Sam wanted me to carry him up the stairs. He's heavy. I was tired. My back was killing me from the pregnancy. I told him no. I told him to use his own legs." She stopped, feeling a tight pressure in her throat. "He cried. Not a tantrum cry. A quiet, broken little cry. Like I had rejected him. I still carried him up. But my pelvis ached for 2 days." She didn't know why she was telling him this. She never told Parker this. Parker would just tell her to book a prenatal massage. Arthur didn't offer advice. He didn't tell her it was going to be okay. "You're carrying the weight of 2 parents," Arthur said quietly. "Your spine isn't built for that. Neither is your heart. But you carry it anyway." Emerson looked up at him. The restaurant noise faded to a dull white hum. She saw the lines around his eyes, the gray hairs threaded through his dark temples. He wasn't a sleek CEO on a blind date anymore. He was a father. A tired, battered father who understood the brutal, unglamorous reality of keeping small humans alive. Suddenly her stomach lurched. The baby, perhaps energized by the Wagyu, executed a violent rolling barrel roll. Emerson gasped, dropping her fork. The heavy silver hit the porcelain plate with a loud clatter. She grabbed her stomach with both hands, her face going pale. "Emerson." Arthur sat up straight, alarm flashing across his features. "Are you okay? Is it happening?" "No, no!" Emerson breathed out, her eyes squeezed shut. "Just an acrobat. This one doesn't kick. It tries to tunnel out." The fabric of her blouse visibly rippled. An alien, distinct lump pushed outward against the navy cotton, sliding from right to left. Arthur's eyes went wide. He stared at her stomach, completely transfixed. The detached, polite reserve he carried was entirely gone, replaced by raw awe. "Jesus," he whispered. "That looks painful." "It feels like a xenomorph from Alien is trying to breach the hull." Emerson gritted out, panting slightly as the pressure eased. She opened her eyes, catching his expression. Without thinking, Arthur reached his hand across the table. His fingers hovered for a second, a few inches from her stomach. Then, realizing what he was doing, he snapped his hand back, as if he had touched a hot stove. Sorry," he muttered, looking embarrassed for the first time all evening. He rubbed the back of his neck, his ears turning slightly red. "Boundary issue. Apologies." Emerson looked at his large calloused hand retreating. She remembered the warmth of his jacket still draped over her shoulders. She remembered the way he knelt on the floor to clean up her mess. "It's fine," Emerson said softly. She reached across the table, grabbed his thick wrist, and pulled his hand back. She placed his palm flat against the tight, hard curve of her upper stomach. Arthur froze. He didn't breathe. Beneath his palm, the baby paused. Then a sharp, distinct thump hit directly against his hand. Arthur let out a breathy, uneven laugh. His eyes snapped up to Emerson's. There was a vulnerability there that made her chest ache. "Strong," he whispered. "Stubborn," Emerson corrected, though a small smile touched her lips. "Like its mother." "Good," Arthur said, his hand remaining gently on her stomach for a second longer before he slowly, respectfully withdrew it. "They're going to need to be tough. The world isn't easy." "No," Emerson agreed, leaning back against the booth, the cold dampness of her trousers completely forgotten beneath the heavy wool of his coat. "It really isn't." The waiter returned cautiously, approaching the table as if expecting another explosion. He cleared the plates. "Dessert menus?" he asked nervously. Arthur looked at Emerson. "I don't know about you," he said, the cynical, exhausted edge returning to his voice, though softer this time. "But I have to go pay a babysitter $20 an hour to peel blue paint off a dog, and you look like you need to sleep for a week." "I do," Emerson admitted. She felt a sudden sharp pang of disappointment. The date was over. Back to reality. Back to the hot car. Back to the frozen nuggets and the quiet apartment. However, Arthur continued pulling his wallet from his back pocket. "If you're free tomorrow morning, Toby has soccer practice at 9. The coffee at the concession stand tastes like battery acid, but there's a playground nearby. Sam could run around. You could sit on a bench. I could sit next to you and complain about port tariffs." Emerson stared at him. He was asking her out again. Not to a Michelin star restaurant, not for drinks. To a chaotic suburban soccer field at an ungodly hour on a Saturday. It was the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to her. "I don't do well in the mornings," Emerson said defensively, her old habits dying hard. "I mean until I've had coffee, and my ankles swell." "I'll bring a thermos of good coffee," Arthur countered smoothly, tossing a black card onto the leather folio the waiter had left. "And I'll bring a folding chair with a footrest. I run logistics, Emerson. I solve problems." Emerson looked at the pink marker on his cuff, then at the gentle, steady expression on his face. She felt the heavy weight of the baby inside her, and for the first time in 7 months the weight didn't feel quite so impossible to carry alone. "Fine," Emerson said, a genuine, unforced smile finally breaking through her exhausted exterior. "But if you bring decaf, the deal is off." Arthur grinned, the lines around his eyes crinkling. "Deal." The Saturday morning air tasted metallic, a harsh blend of car exhaust and damp synthetic turf. Emerson parked her baking Honda next to a towering black SUV. The soccer complex was a chaotic battlefield of nylon folding chairs, screaming children, and exhausted parents clinging to thermal mugs like life preservers. She hauled herself out of the driver's seat, grimacing as her pelvic bone ground sharply against its socket. Sam, clutching a battered plastic dinosaur, tumbled out the back door, freezing instantly as his sneakers hit the dew-soaked grass. He hated wet grass. He let out a low warning whine. It was a siren signaling an impending meltdown. "Sam, please," Emerson muttered, pressing her hands against the throbbing ache in her lower back. She was sweating already, her oversized gray sweater clinging uncomfortably to her damp neck. "It will dry. Just walk on your tiptoes." Sam shook his head frantically, his small knuckles turning white around the plastic toy. The whine pitched higher, piercing the humid morning air. Before Emerson could attempt a logistical nightmare of bending down with her massive stomach, a shadow fell over them. Arthur stood there wearing faded jeans and a dark hooded sweatshirt. He smelled faintly of clean laundry detergent and sharp wood smoke. In his right hand he held a sleek silver thermos. Under his left arm he carried a canvas folding chair with an attached footrest. He looked down at Sam, his expression entirely neutral. "Morning," Arthur said, his deep voice cutting through the noise of the parking lot. "Wet shoes." Emerson sighed a heavy, exhausted sound. "Wet grass. It's a sensory texture thing. If his socks get damp, we have to go home, and I really don't want to go back to my apartment yet." Arthur nodded, slowly assessing the small boy. Without a word, Arthur set the thermos on the roof of the Honda and unfolded the canvas chair right there on the dry asphalt. He turned his back to Sam and crouched down. "I hate wet socks too, buddy," Arthur said calmly, not making direct eye contact, which Emerson knew was the fastest way to overwhelm her son. "Hop on. I'll act as your personal transport vehicle. No charge." Sam stopped whining. He blinked, staring at Arthur's broad back. Slowly, tentatively, Sam stepped forward and wrapped his skinny arms around Arthur's neck, settling onto his back. Emerson watched in stunned silence as Arthur stood up, effortlessly securing Sam's legs behind him. He picked up the chair and the thermos with his free hands. "Lead the way," Arthur said to Emerson, offering a small, crooked smile. They navigated the muddy perimeter of the soccer field. The grass was a slippery nightmare, but Arthur walked with heavy, sure-footed steps, acting as a sturdy anchor. They reached a relatively dry patch of earth near the midfield line. Arthur set the chair down, flipped out the footrest, and gestured toward it. "Your throne awaits, Emerson. Please sit before you collapse." She sank into the canvas fabric. The relief on her spine was immediate and profound. She groaned softly, closing her eyes for a fraction of a second. When she opened them, Arthur was unscrewing the lid of the silver thermos. He poured out a cup of steaming dark liquid and handed it to her. The smell hit her instantly, rich, dark roast coffee with a subtle hint of cinnamon. "Caffeinated?" Arthur confirmed, taking a seat on the damp grass beside her chair, completely ignoring the mud seeping into his jeans. "And hot. Drink it before the chaos begins." Emerson took a sip. It was perfect. She let out a long breath, watching Sam, who had slid off Arthur's back and was now cautiously tapping his plastic dinosaur against the metal leg of her chair, entirely content. On the field, a herd of 6-year-olds was swarming a deflated soccer ball. "Which one is the hurricane?" Emerson asked, wrapping her cold hands around the hot metal cup. Arthur pointed a thick finger toward a blur of motion in a red jersey. The boy was running in the completely wrong direction, chasing a yellow butterfly instead of the ball. "That's Toby." Arthur said, a mixture of profound affection and sheer exhaustion bleeding into his tone. "He has the attention span of a goldfish and the energy output of a nuclear reactor." Emerson watched the boy trip over his own shoelaces, fall face first into the mud, and instantly pop back up, laughing hysterically. "He looks happy," she observed quietly. Arthur dragged a hand down his face, rubbing his rough jawline. "He is, most of the time, but keeping him happy requires constant, exhausting vigilance. If I look away for 10 seconds, he's eating dirt or tackling the referee." They sat in comfortable silence for a long time. The morning sun began to burn off the damp haze, warming Emerson's face. The baby rolled heavily in her stomach, a slow, aching stretch that made her gasp slightly. Arthur shifted his weight on the grass, looking up at her. "Rough night?" he asked, his dark eyes observant. Emerson nodded, staring down at her swollen belly. "I can't sleep. My hips ache. I have heartburn that feels like battery acid, and every time I close my eyes, I panic about how I'm going to afford diapers on a single income." "Mimi?" She hadn't meant to say that last part aloud. The vulnerability tasted sour in her mouth. She braced herself for the standard hollow reassurances. "You'll figure it out. Babies don't need much." But Arthur didn't offer platitudes. He pulled a blade of grass from the ground and shredded it between his calloused fingers. "The logistics of parenting alone are fundamentally flawed," he said flatly. "It's a 2-person job forced onto one. The math never works. You're always running a massive deficit." Emerson turned her head, looking at his profile. The harsh lines of his face were entirely serious. So how do you do it?" Emerson asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. "How do you wake up every day and do the math knowing it's going to fail?" Arthur tossed the shredded grass aside. He watched Toby finally kick the ball, sending it flying out of bounds directly into a puddle. "You stop trying to balance the equation," Arthur replied, his voice heavy with hard-won truth. "You just accept that you're going to drop balls. You're going to fail. You will yell when you shouldn't. You will serve frozen waffles for dinner 3 nights in a row." He looked directly at her, his eyes locking onto hers. "You survive the messes, Emerson. You don't prevent them." A loud whistle pierced the air. The game was over. A stampede of muddy, sweaty children charged the sidelines. Toby slammed into Arthur's chest, wiping a thick streak of brown mud directly across Arthur's clean gray sweatshirt. Arthur didn't flinch. He just wrapped his large arms around the squirming boy. Emerson watched them, a sudden sharp ache blooming in her chest. She looked down at her own son, quietly playing by her feet. "Toby, this is Sam," Arthur said, peeling the muddy boy off his chest. Toby wiped his running nose with the back of his dirty hand and stared at Sam. Sam shrank back, clutching his dinosaur tightly to his chest, terrified of the loud, dirty intruder. Toby dug into his pocket and pulled out a crushed, slightly melted granola bar. He held it out to Sam. "You want this? I sat on it," Toby offered cheerfully. Sam looked at the bar, then at Emerson. Emerson nodded encouragingly. Sam reached out, taking the crushed bar with 2 hesitant fingers. It wasn't a magical blending of families. It was messy, awkward, and sticky. But as Arthur helped Emerson up from the chair, taking her elbow to support her weight, she felt a strange sensation in her chest. It felt terrifyingly like hope. The walk back to the cars was slow. Arthur carried the chair, the thermos, and Sam. Toby ran ahead, kicking pebbles. "So," Arthur said, stopping by her driver's side door, "I have to power wash Toby. But maybe next weekend we could do something slightly less muddy. A museum, a playground with rubber mats." Emerson leaned against her car, exhausted to her bones, but smiling. "Rubber mats sound highly logical, Mr. Hayes." 3 weeks later, the humidity broke, replaced by a biting autumn chill. Emerson's apartment smelled of burnt toast and bleach. She stood in the narrow kitchen, staring blankly at a pile of unpaid utility bills, feeling a dull, rhythmic cramping low in her abdomen. She ignored it. Braxton Hicks. It had to be. She was only 34 weeks along. She gripped the edge of the cheap Formica counter, her knuckles white, waiting for the tightening to stop. It didn't. Instead, it gripped harder, wrapping around her lower back like a hot iron vise. Arthur was sitting on her worn living room rug, patiently showing Sam how to connect two stubbornly incompatible pieces of a wooden train track. Toby was asleep on the sofa, his mouth hanging open, one foot dangling dangerously close to a half-empty cup of apple juice. The domestic scene was painfully normal, a sharp contrast to the panic suddenly seizing Emerson's throat. She tried to take a deep breath, but her lungs felt compressed. A sudden, terrifying wetness flooded her underwear, soaking through her cotton sweatpants and hitting the linoleum floor with a soft, distinct splat. She looked down. The fluid was tinged with a faint, pale pink. "Arthur!" Emerson choked out. Her voice was thin, reedy, completely stripped of its usual cynical armor. Arthur's head snapped up. He took one look at her face, pale and shining with cold sweat, and then looked at the small puddle forming by her bare feet. He didn't panic. The logistical CEO took over. He dropped the wooden train track. "Toby, up!" Arthur barked, his voice carrying an unquestionable authority that woke the boy instantly. "Sam, grab your shoes. Emerson, lean against the counter. Don't move." He was across the room in 3 strides, grabbing her packed hospital bag from by the door and hauling Toby off the couch. The ride to the hospital was a blur of excruciating pain and mundane reality. Arthur drove Emerson's cramped Honda because moving the car seats to his SUV would have wasted 5 minutes. He drove with white-knuckled precision, taking corners sharply but smoothly. Emerson sat in the passenger seat, crushing the door handle. Her eyes squeezed shut as another contraction ripped through her. It was too early. The math was wrong. The terror was a cold physical weight in her chest, suffocating her. She let out a low, guttural groan, entirely unbothered by how she sounded. "Breathe, Emerson," Arthur commanded quietly from the driver's seat. He reached across the center console, ignoring the lingering smell of stale Cheerios, and clamped his large, warm hand over her knee. "I'm tracking the traffic. We are exactly 7 minutes away. The boys are quiet in the back. You are doing perfectly." He wasn't feeding her false hope. He was giving her hard data, and strangely it grounded her. She focused on the heavy pressure of his hand, using it as an anchor while her body tried to tear itself apart from the inside. The triage room was violently bright, smelling intensely of rubbing alcohol and industrial floor cleaner. Nurses swarmed her, their voices a buzzing drone of medical jargon. Preterm labor, dilation at 6, heart rate monitoring. Arthur was pushed to the periphery, standing awkwardly by the sterile sink, holding her ugly beige cardigan. Emerson was terrified. The cynical, tough exterior she wore like armor had completely dissolved, leaving her raw exposed and violently shaking from the adrenaline and pain. She looked across the chaotic room, her eyes desperately seeking the one solid thing in it. "Arthur!" she gasped, reaching out a trembling hand through the tangle of IV tubes. He didn't hesitate. He crossed the room, ignoring the nurse who tried to intercept him, and grabbed her hand. His grip was almost painfully tight, anchoring her to the hospital bed. "I'm right here," he said, his voice a low rumble near her ear. "You're going to do this. You're strong. You carry the weight. Remember?" He didn't tell her it wouldn't hurt. He didn't tell her the baby would definitely be perfectly fine. He just acknowledged the brutal reality of the moment and promised to stand in the mud with her. 2 hours later, the room descended into a chaotic screaming climax. Emerson pushed until blood vessels popped in her cheeks, her vision swimming with dark spots. The pain was entirely consuming a roaring fire in her pelvis. Arthur held one of her legs, his face pale, his jaw set in a hard, grim line, whispering a steady stream of low, encouraging curses that oddly comforted her. With one final agonizing heave, the pressure suddenly vanished, replaced by a slippery, heavy warmth and the immediate sharp sound of a furious, reedy cry. "It's a girl," the doctor announced quickly, wiping down the tiny red screaming creature. Because she was early, they whisked the baby over to the warming table immediately. Emerson collapsed back onto the pillows, her chest-heaving sweat stinging her eyes. She felt entirely hollowed out, utterly destroyed, and more exhausted than she had ever been in her life. She turned her head weakly. Arthur was leaning against the wall, his chest rising and falling rapidly. There were tears standing in his dark, exhausted eyes. He looked at Emerson, shaking his head in silent, profound awe. He walked over his legs, looking unsteady. He didn't say anything profound. He just leaned down and pressed a long, dry kiss to her sweaty forehead. "Math is overrated," he whispered against her skin, his thumb brushing a damp strand of hair from her cheek. "We'll survive the mess." They weren't a perfect cinematic family. They were a divorced mother of two, a cynical single father, a child who hated wet grass, a child who painted dogs blue, and a premature baby screaming under fluorescent lights. It was loud, chaotic, and terrifyingly complicated. But as Emerson watched Arthur walk over to the warming table, staring down at her tiny, furious daughter with a look of absolute terrified devotion, she knew one thing for certain. For the first time in a very long time, she wasn't carrying the weight entirely alone. The reality of love isn't found in perfect dinners or seamless families. It's forged in the messy, loud, exhausting trenches of real life. Emerson and Arthur proved that sometimes the best partner isn't the one who fixes everything, but the one who sits in the mud beside you. Did this raw, grounded story resonate with your own messy reality? Hit that like button, share it with someone carrying a heavy load, and subscribe for more brutally honest stories.